Good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining this webinar on the Regional Energy Efficiency Policy Recommendations for Latin America and the Caribbean. This webinar is organized by the International Energy Agency with the kind support of the Secretaría de Energía, CENER, and my name is David Morgado and I'll be the moderator and presenter for today. The basis for this webinar is a publication produced by the International Energy Agency in collaboration with the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the Ministry of Energy and Mines of Peru, and with the contribution of more than 50 energy efficiency experts from the region, including staff from CENER and CONUI. Going through the agenda for today, we would really like to hear from you and would like to include your voice in the conversation. So please ask questions and share comments so that we can discuss these at the end of the webinar. So today we have an introduction, and then we'll have some welcome remarks by Santiago Crujeras, Director General of Energy Efficiency and Energy Sustainability at CENER. We'll cover some slides on the importance of energy efficiency, and then I'll give you some background and introduction on the energy efficiency policies for Latin America and the Caribbean, and then we'll go into detail on the 20 recommendations across 5 sectors, and then finally we'll have questions and answers and discussion. So before we start the webinar, we'd like to go through the setup of the webinar and let you know how you can participate in today's session. The slide shows you an example of the attendee interface. You should see something like this in your computer. You've joined today's webinar listening through your computer's speaker system by default. This means if you usually can hear music on your computer, you'll be able to hear the presentation. If you'd like to call us using the telephone, you can locate your audio pane and select Use Phone, and the dial-in information access will then be displayed. And you can see there the number for Mexico and the access code for this webinar. You also have the ability to ask questions using your questions pane. So simply type in your question either in English or Spanish and click send. Then at the end of the presentation we'll do the Q&A session. And we can also take questions during the session using the hand raising option to allow you to speak if you have a microphone or dialing in through the telephone. Please note that we'll be recording the webinar and we'll make a link available for those that have missed the webinar, as well as if you want to share it with your colleagues or would like to go over it again. So if there's no questions at the moment, I will proceed with the introduction speech by Santiago Crujeras, which I think will be online. And so Santiago Crujeras is Director General of Energy Efficiency and Energy Sustainability from CENER.
Hello, can you actually hear me?
Hi Santiago, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, once again, my name is Santiago Crujeras. I'm the Director General for Energy Efficiency and Sustainability of Mexico. On behalf of the Ministry of Energy and the International Energy Agency, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar of the CENER IEA webinar series in regards to the politics for Latin America on energy efficiency. We will have David Morgado talking on behalf of the agency. We started this practice a few months ago, and it has turned out to be a practice that the agency has adopted not only for Mexico but for other countries. The webinar practice has become a a very successful tool with a lot of impact in many countries. Last time we had over 100 people participating in the webinar, and I'm glad to hear that we have a great number of people connected today. We have almost 80 people joining this webinar today. We will discuss the importance of energy efficiency. We will have a background and introduction of the document, as well as the different recommendations across the 5 sectors that this document has suggested. So once again, on behalf of Mexico, on behalf of the Ministry of Energy, and on behalf of the International Energy Agency, it's a great pleasure to have you all here, and we really hope that you enjoy this seminar, you learn a lot from this seminar, and you can apply all of the learning from this seminar to whatever you are doing, whether it's in your jobs, whether it's in the sector, or whether it's for your own sake. David, thank you so much for organizing this, for also Ana Lepur here in Mexico, the International Energy Agency representative, who has supported us on organizing this on this side, as well as the rest of my team here at the Office of the Director General for Energy Efficiency and Sustainability. So with that, I welcome all of you to get started. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Santiago, for your welcome remarks, and thank you as well for all your support in organizing these webinars, which will be continuing throughout this year, still with another webinar on the Energy Efficiency Market Report 2015, and we'll be organizing a series of other webinars in 2016, and we'll keep everybody posted. Without further ado, so I'll start with some introduction on the importance of energy efficiency, and just highlighting one of the reasons why we've done this publication. So before I discuss the energy efficiency policy recommendations for Latin America and the Caribbean, I'd like to highlight the global and regional importance of energy efficiency and why energy efficiency measures and policies need to increase considerably in the region. As you all know, 2015 is a special year, and we're only 1 month away approximately from COP21 in Paris. In the IEA's World Energy Outlook Special Report on Energy and Climate Change, published in June 2015, shows that if implemented, the so-called intended National Determined Contribution Scenario, INDCs, the pledges countries have been invited to make to the UNFCCC, will slow the growth of greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector, as you can see here on the graph on the left. But will not allow for an absolute reduction of emissions and will not constrain the increase in global temperatures of 2 degrees Celsius. Under the bridge scenario, developed under this publication, the Special Report on Energy and Climate Change from the World Energy Outlook, we've identified 5 areas for further action that would achieve a peak in emissions by 2020, you can see there, using only proven available technologies and without harming economic growth. These measures are highlighted here on the graph on the right, and the most important areas you can see is energy efficiency, representing 49% of the greenhouse gas emission savings by 2030 under this bridge scenario. It's followed by investments in renewables, reduction of upstream methane emissions in oil and gas exploitation, fossil fuel subsidy reform, and reduction of inefficient coal use in subcritical plants. So this is a global view. So it just highlights why why energy efficiency is important globally. Looking more into the region, this slide shows the total final energy consumption on the left y-axis and the energy intensity on the right y-axis going from 1971 to 2013 for non-OECD America. So it's all of Latin America and the Caribbean, excluding Chile and Mexico as they are OECD member countries. So what you can see there is from 2003 to 2013, total final energy consumption rose on average by 3.1% per year, and electricity consumption increased by 4.3% on average per year, from 675 terawatt hours to 1,000 terawatt hours, so almost doubling in 10 years. This is looking from 2003 to 2013. This rise in electricity consumption was approximately equivalent to the electricity generation of 4 Itaipu dams of 14 gigawatt capacity each. In contrast, energy intensity has decreased at a relatively slow pace and on average by 1.4% per year for the same period. Given that energy demand in the region is projected to continue to grow significantly over the next decades, improving energy efficiency is more important than ever. So, to increase the uptake of energy efficiency measures in the region, under the IEA's Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies E4 program, we developed regional energy efficiency policy recommendations for Latin America and the Caribbean with the support of more than 50 energy efficiency experts in the region, and in collaboration with the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the Ministry of Energy and Mines of Peru. To give you a bit of background on the publication, in 2008 the IEA launched the 25 Energy Efficiency Policy Recommendations, which was particularly directed at G8 countries. The objective was to have a package of measures to significantly enhance the implementation of energy efficiency at the time. The publication was updated again in 2011, but most developing countries felt that there was need to adapt the recommendations to regional and cultural contexts. Therefore, in 2014 and 2015, the IEA adapted them to 3 regions that you see there, including Latin America and the Caribbean in 2015. So these are the regional energy efficiency policy recommendations, and they are available for free on the IEA website. The publication for Latin America and Caribbean is available in both English and Spanish. And the publication is a brief 12-page document, particularly directed at policymakers. The objective of the publication for Latin America and the Caribbean was to support government stakeholders in prioritizing and implementing energy efficiency policies for their countries, but also as an effective way to increase awareness and obtain high-level political support for scaled-up energy efficiency efforts in the region. The energy efficiency policy recommendations for the region were first developed during one-day workshop at the 5th Energy Efficiency Policy Dialogue in Peru, and then were reviewed during the Regional Sustainable Energy Training Week for Latin America and Chile. A draft was sent out in March 2015, and the report was then finalized in July 2015. As I mentioned, it included contributions from more than 50 energy efficiency experts in the region, including staff from CENER and CONUE in Mexico. You can see here the list of these supporting organizations, and you can see that there was a wide range of regional organizations, 8 in total, and we also had countries and territories, 22 in total. And you can see some photos of the events that we organized to discuss the policy recommendations for the region. Our partner in this publication, United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, known as UN-ECLAC or CEPAL in Spanish, kindly highlighted the publication's importance to the region, as well as supporting the discussions undertaken during the annual Energy Efficiency Policy Dialogues events organized by UN-ECLAC. And the previous one was in Peru, and this year they're having it in Aruba. So moving on to the more interesting part, which is the 20 recommendations across five sectors. So the 5 sectors are cross-sectoral, or in Spanish, políticas transversales. The second one is buildings, edificaciones. The third, lighting, appliances, and equipment, alumbrado, aparatos y equipos. The fourth, transport, transporte, and finally industria. So moving on to the cross-sectoral, economic growth in Latin America and the Caribbean is closely linked with energy consumption, and better access to energy has enabled improvements in the quality of life of many people in the region. However, it has also meant a greater dependence on fossil fuel imports. For both Latin America and the Caribbean, there are some barriers that are common across all sectors and are hindering improvements in energy efficiency. Governments can play a key role in overcoming these barriers and ensuring there's a solid institutional framework to successfully accelerate implementation of energy efficiency measures. Cross-sectoral energy efficiency policy recommendations. So the first one we have was to designate lead institution for planning, coordinating, and implementing and monitoring energy efficiency policies and programs. So basically we're talking here about institutions that take the lead on energy efficiency policies and coordinate with other government agencies to really drive energy efficiency measures in the country. There are several countries in the region that have these agencies already, but due to limited capacity and resources, some still require further funding support and legislation to strengthen their ability to effectively implement and monitor national energy efficiency programs. In Mexico, as you're aware, you have CENER and CONUI that take the lead on policy and technical support on energy efficiency in the country. The second recommendation is to establish regular energy efficiency data collection and indicators. Data collection during the design, implementation, and evaluation phases is an essential part of any energy efficiency program. There's need for more and better quality data on energy efficiency and to develop indicators that can effectively support decision-making on energy efficiency measures. We recognize the effort being made by the UNECLAC, ADEM, and partner countries in this area in the region. This is an area that in Mexico is progressing well, but government stakeholders recognize that a greater effort is needed with the support of the private sector and local governments. The third recommendation we have is remove inefficient energy subsidies. Low energy prices as a result of fossil fuel and electricity subsidies result in higher energy consumption and reduce the demand for energy efficiency investment. And as energy consumption rises, these subsidies can become a major financial burden to governments. In 2013, Mexico was in the 13th place with highest fossil fuel subsidy in the world. To address this, the government has been raising the prices of gasoline and diesel each month in 2014 to bring them closer to international levels. The federal government did so by eliminating the support it provides for consumption of gasoline and diesel fuel through the Impuesto Especial sobre Producción y Servicios de Inagestión de Gasolinas y Diesel. Together with the lower international prices, these efforts have contributed to reducing total consumer support in Mexico from 244 billion Mexican pesos in 2012 to only 34 billion Mexican pesos in 2014. Since late 2014, rates of the IEPS have been positive, and it's expected that these will generate revenues of around 1% of GDP in 2015. The fourth recommendation is to stimulate investment in energy efficiency. There's a high dependence on national government funding for energy efficiency in the region, and therefore it's important to stimulate both private and public sector investment to complement this funding. Measures can include stimulating public-private partnerships, stimulating local financing schemes by local banks, stimulating ESCO market development, and many others. In Mexico, there's ongoing progress by several different ministries which should be continued, but local government and private sector really need to contribute further. And finally, the fifth recommendation, develop information and awareness campaigns and educational programs. Regular communication and outreach campaigns, as well as the inclusion of educational programs on energy efficiency in schools and training of technical experts, can ensure energy efficiency is an integral part or decision-making process. In Mexico, several organizations are working independently in this area, and a medium-term national strategy would be ideal to ensure regular and effective communication and also make best use of the limited resources and capacity. Moving on to the next sector, buildings. In 2012, buildings accounted for approximately 16% of the total final energy consumption in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is likely to increase with the expansion of urban areas and with further economic growth and improvement in standards of living. A strong driver for this growth is the inevitable rising demand for and use of appliances and equipment such as air conditioning. Therefore, the building energy efficiency policy recommendations start with improving the energy performance of building components and systems. By implementing minimum energy performance standards for building components and systems, such as windows, insulation, ventilation, hot water, heating and cooling systems. Governments should also facilitate improvements in high-efficiency building components and systems through the publication of best practice guidelines and enhanced research, development, and demonstration programs. In Mexico, as you're probably aware, there's a series of norms and NMXs covering these building components. The next recommendation is to improve building energy performance. Governments should support the development, adoption, and enforcement of building energy codes and maps, which provide a minimum quality level for buildings in the country. For existing buildings, a combination of policies that improve the minimum codes and also the efficiency of buildings through renovation, operation, and maintenance best practices is recommended. For new buildings, a combination of policies that enhance minimum codes and also the efficiency of buildings during the design, construction, and operation phases is recommended. In Mexico, there are building codes, but the biggest challenge by far is the enforcement of building codes by local governments. SENER and CONUR are working with the IEA and many international organizations throughout the country to address this issue. The next recommendation is to implement energy labels, certificates, or disclosure of energy consumption. So after you address minimum energy performance and high energy performance in buildings and their components and systems, governments should require public display of information that will improve decision-making, including labels, certificates, and public disclosure of energy consumption for selected buildings. In Mexico, CONUE is working in this field, but if enforcement is already a challenge at local level, then labeling would be an equally challenging process. So it's probably something to consider in the medium to longer term. Final recommendation is to aim for net zero energy consumption in buildings. Supporting research, development, and implementation of low energy use of net zero ready buildings can be beneficial for advancing future building codes and standards. In Mexico in 2010, CONAVI started a pilot project of zero energy housing with the financing and technical support of the Canadian Ministry of Environment. Other projects under the Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions with GIZ support have been implemented, but most are still pilot projects only, and the market is yet to be realized in this area. Moving on to lighting appliances and equipment. According to a UNEP study in 2014, the introduction of standards and a transition to best available energy efficient refrigerators, air conditioners, and electric fans in households in the region could result in annual energy savings of 130 terawatt hours, equivalent to $20 billion. Therefore, in terms of recommendations for the lighting appliances and equipment for the region, we have the first one, which is implement mandatory minimum energy performance standards, known as MEPS, and energy labels for lighting appliances and equipment. This can be done by three main points. Firstly, by regular update and continuous improvement of standards and label categories. Secondly, by the inclusion of energy performance criteria in public procurement, compras públicas. And thirdly, well-resourced and targeted monitoring and enforcement regimes. In Mexico, there are several norms for appliances and equipment that are regularly updated, and energy efficiency requirements are included in federal public procurement, but there are greater efforts needed to include it in local governments and public procurement. The next recommendation is to the phase out of least efficient products. And this can be done in two ways, through taxation, subsidies, and regulations to trigger uptake of high efficient products. And secondly, by combining it with MEPs, market transformation, and other phase-out policies. In Mexico, in 2010, CONUE published the standard NOM 028 that sets MEPs to phase out incandescent bulbs in the residential sector according to different wattages and efficacy. The third recommendation for this sector is engage in regional collaboration and harmonization of standards and testing procedures. This can be done in two ways: to reduce compliance and testing costs, and secondly, to increase demand for energy efficient products. Mexico has been working at harmonizing several norms, particularly with the US. Finally, promote market transformation policies. As the adoption of regulatory framework for standards and label can take time to be effectively implemented, market transformation policies and programs can be complementary and enable behavioral changes, leading to significant energy savings in a short period. Therefore, governments should explore the introduction of financial incentives, procurement programs, and other measures focusing on cost-effective, high-efficiency appliances and equipment. In Mexico, to give one of many examples, from 2010 to 2015, the Mexican government implemented an efficient lighting and appliances project to promote the adoption of energy-efficient technologies such as CFLs. Approximately 45.8 million incandescent bulbs were replaced with CFLs in 11.3 million households, resulting in estimated savings of almost 7,000 gigawatt hours. The project also replaced a total of 1.9 million refrigerators and air conditioners, resulting in estimated savings of almost 2,500 gigawatt hours. Moving on to the transport sector. The transport sector represented approximately 36% of the total final energy consumption in Latin America and the Caribbean in 2012. Increasing demand for mobility in the region is causing a number of challenges for transport system planning and infrastructure, especially in Latin American cities. Therefore, these transport energy efficiency policy recommendations that I'm going to present are very important. They're based on the Avoid, Shift, and Improve model, which helps transport decision makers to holistically design low-emission transport strategies by assessing opportunities to avoid the need for travel, shift to less carbon-intensive modes, and improve on conventional technologies, infrastructure, and policies. Based on this model, the following best practices to enhance energy efficiency in the transport sector could be applicable to the region. The first one, improve transport system planning and efficiency. This can be done by diversification of transport systems and fuel sources, coordination between national, regional, and local authorities, and finally, complementary financial measures. In Mexico, for example, Panobras has a financing program for local governments that supports the implementation of mass transit systems. Majority of the projects are bus rapid transit systems, but could also cover trains, subways, light rail, and trams. The program is called PROTRAM, Programa de Apoyo Federal al Transporte Masivo, and was created in 2008. The next recommendation is implement mandatory vehicle efficiency standards and labeling. This can be done by regular update of standards and also complementary incentives and taxation policies to influence decision making and accelerate market uptake of efficient and low emission vehicles. And finally, by the harmonization of vehicle and fuel efficiency standards. In Mexico, there are fuel efficiency standards for light-duty vehicles, and in addition, CONUE and Semarnat are currently working on one for heavy-duty vehicles, which is very important. The next recommendation is to promote fuel-efficient non-engine components through standards and test procedures. The efficiency of vehicle components such as tires, air conditioning, and aerodynamic devices can play an important role in enhancing overall vehicle fuel efficiency, especially for heavy-duty vehicles. In Mexico, this activity in this area is currently relatively limited at the moment. Finally, enhance vehicle operational efficiency. This can be done through training and information awareness, regular mandatory maintenance and inspections, and finally, in-vehicle eco-driving feedback systems in new cars. In Mexico, CONUE provides a series of information to the general public on best driving practices, selection of tires, route planning, saving fuel for light-duty vehicles, as well as information for professional drivers for heavy-duty vehicles. However, there's no inclusion of efficient driving for obtaining your driver's license, and that's something that's increasingly being considered in many countries. Moving on to the final sector, industry. The industrial sector in Latin America, and also in some countries in the Caribbean, represented 32% of the total final energy consumption in the region in 2012. There's substantial potential for energy efficiency in the industrial sector, which can be addressed through the industrial energy efficiency policy recommendations. The first recommendation is to promote energy management and energy efficiency projects. This can be done through monitoring and reporting through the implementation of energy management systems. It can be done through benchmarking of key indicators among industries, and finally by preventive maintenance and loss reduction. In Mexico, CONUE is working with several energy efficiency projects with industry, including pilot projects and guidelines on energy management systems under the Programa Nacional para Sistemas de Gestión de la Energía. The next recommendation is promote high-efficiency industrial equipment and systems. This can be done through the adoption of minimum energy performance standards for industrial equipment, such as motors, the promotion of best available technologies in the region or internationally, and finally by training and capacity building to ensure optimal operation and application of best practices. Because it's not only about having the best technologies, but ensuring they're used optimally. In Mexico, there are also norms for electric motors and several other industrial equipment, and there are organizations that provide ongoing training. The final recommendation is stimulate the development of energy efficiency products and services for small and medium-sized enterprises. Governments should consider the introduction of specifically designed policies and programs for the promotion and implementation of energy efficiency measures in small and medium enterprises. These may include, for example, support mechanisms for promoting and conducting energy audits, provision of information and guidelines applicable to each subsector, regular capacity building activities including sharing of best practices and experiences, and finally supporting the development of financial instruments to reduce investment risk for local banks. In Mexico, CONUE provides ongoing technical support and guidelines to SMEs on energy efficiency measures. So after all these recommendations, we asked the energy efficiency experts in the region to indicate which ones should be priority for their governments. And these three cross-sectoral recommendations were selected, as you can see. These were strongly recommended to provide foundation for national energy efficiency strategy. Under a second level of priority, these are the recommendations highlighted. They were covering cross-sectoral, lighting appliances and equipment, and industry. And these were particularly recommended for immediate adoption by all governments in the region. We also had a third and fourth level of priorities that were equally important, but they're included in the publication and were recommended for consideration by all governments in the region and immediate adoption in most countries, and some of them were recommended for consideration and adoption. And with this slide, I conclude my presentation on energy efficiency policy recommendations for Latin America and the Caribbean. Before we move to the Q&A and discussion session, I'd just like to mention that we will be organizing another webinar in partnership with CENER on the 10th of November, starting at 10 o'clock Mexico time, on IEA's Energy Efficiency Market Report 2015, which is free publication to download from the IEA webpage. The Energy Efficiency Market Report builds awareness and understanding about market activity, its drivers, and impacts. This year's report includes an in-depth look into the buildings energy efficiency market and the electricity sector. Energy efficiency investments in building sector totaled between $90 billion in 2014. In the electricity sector, energy efficiency has proved critical in flattening electricity consumption in OECD member countries, which Mexico is part of, driving utilities to adapt their business models. So now I'll give you a bit of time to look at some of the questions that we have so far, and I'll add my colleague Anna Lepore as well to help me with some of these questions. So just bear with us for a couple of seconds so we can go through some of the questions. Thank you. Anna, I don't know if you want to start with any of the questions that we have so far. So I've just gone through some of the questions. There's some, most of the questions are to do with the voice level, and there's no, there's no questions at the moment on regarding the recommendations. So if you're interested in putting a question up, you can write it in the questions panel on the GoToMeeting. So I'll just give another couple of seconds for people to write any questions that they might have. Thank you. We have a question already. Somebody was asking what's the main recommendation for Latin America and compared to other regions, I imagine. In most regions, the cross-sectoral recommendations were the ones that came up first. So the designating lead institutions for planning, coordinating, and implementing and monitoring energy efficiency policies and programs usually came first. The removing inefficient energy subsidies as well were very important. Some of the ones that we have in the second one, although there was slight difference between the regions in terms of what their priority was, but in most cases stimulating investment in energy efficiency was there. The implementation of mandatory minimum energy performance standards and labels for appliances and equipment as well. And then for industry, promoting energy management systems was there as well. I'm just going to see some of the, a lot of other questions are coming through, so just give me some time to go through them. So I've got an interesting question where somebody asks why the transport sector isn't in the priority recommendations. And I think the reason that was that of the 50 energy efficiency experts that we had very few from the transport sector, particularly when we're talking about the Caribbean. There was very few people that were focusing on transport. They focused particularly on the appliances and cross-sectoral and buildings, and therefore the reason transport isn't in the main, sort of the second level or the first priority level. But what I'd like to mention is that of all these 20 recommendations, they're all equally important, and it's then up to the country to look at them and speak with the policymakers and decide how they want to implement some of these. We recognize there's some limitations. You can't go to a policymaker and say we want to implement all these 20. You'll have to prioritize, and so that was the main reason for that exercise. But again, not to say that the transport recommendations are not important. They're all priority. There's some that are high priority, medium priority, but overall they're 20 priority recommendations. I'm just going through some of the other questions. Just give me a couple of seconds. There's the question of where, based on experience, which areas and could you have more energy efficiency measures with greater results or sort of higher cost benefit. I think definitely by far that would be industry. The next one I'd probably include, or very closely behind industry, would be transport. Of course, then thirdly, there's a lot to do in terms of buildings. In terms of what would be easy to apply in industry would be energy management systems, and that would be one of the main priorities as highlighted here. In terms of transport, continuing a lot of what's been done in Mexico to replicate it and improve the bus rapid transit systems and other systems for public transport, I think would be very important. So those are the ones that I would recommend. So I'm just going through some other questions. There are a lot of them coming through just now. So one person was asking about if the document's available in Spanish. There's a freely available on the IEA website. I'll ask my colleague Anna Lepore also to provide the link to the Spanish version and send you a PDF of the presentation. And then there's some questions in terms of barriers for energy efficiency in the region. So there's a number of barriers in terms of for appliances, for example, in terms of there's cheaply available a lot of inefficient appliances in many of the countries in Latin America, and therefore the introduction of standards and labeling is very, very important. There's in transport, for example, there's an interesting thing that was mentioned in the discussions in the region. There's a lot of second-hand market vehicles, and some of these are not fully addressed through the fuel economy standards, and therefore it's something that needs to be taken into consideration. Particularly for Mexico, I definitely include as well the inefficient energy subsidies, which should be removed. so that the government is doing at the moment and should continue. And then the other barriers that I've noticed in the region is there's a lot of dependence on government funding for energy efficiency, and it's good that it is there, but it's important to start reaching a point where there's more investment needed for energy efficiency, especially to reach a lot of the climate change and greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, and that can only be really done with the private sector and private sector investment. So if that could be overcome, working with the local private banks to find out how they can overcome questions or regarding restrictions regarding risk, trying to work more with the energy service companies and trying to help them grow so that they're able to provide all these services and meet the market demand are particularly important. And I think that's something that should be addressed, particularly in Mexico and in Brazil. So I think we're reaching the end of our presentation, and then webinar. So what I'll do is I'd like to thank you everyone for your attention and participation in today's webinar. The presentation should be available by the end of this week on the IEA's YouTube website, and we'll be sending you a link, so please feel free to share with your colleagues. For us, it's been a real pleasure to conduct this webinar, which we hope you have found useful. We would also like to thank SENER and Anna Lepore, our IEA staff at SENER, for all their support and helping us organize these webinars. Thank you very much.